and welcome to Brown Bag, a podcast series looking at the interconnections between media, social media in particular, democracy, politics, and technology from a global south perspective. My name is Sanjana Hattotuwa, and I am a special advisor at the ICT for Peace Foundation.
But this was a situation where the live stream had been really virally propagated across the internet. It had started auto-playing on some people's social media feeds. I was aware that school children had been viewing the live stream lying on the floor in lockdown in their classrooms in Christchurch, wondering what the hell was going on. And I started talking to people throughout the system about my concerns for what this would mean in terms of not just an infodemic, but a rise in very, very extreme conspiracy theories that would ultimately be connected to or have at their base a white supremacist or an extremist ideology motivation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Brown Bag. I'm speaking with the former chief censor of Aotearoa, New Zealand, David Shanks. I've had the distinct pleasure of knowing David for a couple of years, and I'm so glad that he's able to join me today and all of you listening in to talk about some of the issues that this podcast series covers. David, a very warm welcome to the program.
Kia ora, great to be here.
David, you were only the 12th chief censor in New Zealand. Now, I am familiar with the title as a consequence of professional engagements over some years, but it might be a point of curiosity, if not consternation, to some of the listeners upon hearing that. And you know, since 1917, there's just been 12 of you. The 13th has just been appointed at the time of recording. But could you explain and clarify what the Western world's last chief censor is about?
Yeah, look, happy to. It's certainly a confronting title for many, and in fact, I thought as much coming into the role back in 2017. I thought, well, chief censor, that's an interesting and somewhat arresting title, and I didn't really appreciate just how potentially confronting it was until I travelled to an international classifiers conference in Stockholm in Sweden in 2017, soon after becoming chief censor, and I would introduce myself to peers effectively gathered from around the world, and I'd introduce myself. Hi, I'm David Shanks from New Zealand. I'm the chief censor for New Zealand, and some of them would almost involuntarily recoil as I said that. And in fact, I was presenting at the conference, and I took the opportunity for a bit of a spot survey and introduced myself as chief censor. And I said, by the way, censorship doesn't seem to feature in many titles or many organisation titles, and I wonder who here has censorship as a formal title or as part of the title for their organisation. And I think one hand went up. There was 50, 60 or more people gathered from around the world. One hand went up, and that was a representative from Singapore. And she said, yeah, we've still got censorship in our formal organisation title, but we're getting rid of that in a few months' time. So I gathered that it had very much gone out of fashion. But I mean, historically, you mentioned that I was the 12th. That's interesting. I'd never actually counted up the numbers, but the title chief censor extends back a long way in New Zealand's media regulation and classification history. And it originally applied to specific types of product, notably film censorship. So there was a film censor, and then there was a chief censor later on. And effectively, what we have here in New Zealand is a fairly interesting situation, partly by design, I'd like to think, partly by accident, where the chief censor is the chief executive of the classification office. It's an independent Crown entity. And yes, we do classify and sometimes censor films with extreme violent or extreme sexual content and the like. But the mandate is much broader than that. So we occupy a role of classifying commercial content, videos, games, films and the like, but also internet content. So material that might be classified as unlawful, child sexual abuse material is one example, extreme terrorist promotional material is another. Anything on that is content that can be analog or digital comes within the purview of the classification office. So material is typically referred through to the office from law enforcement authorities, Department of Internal Affairs, police, customs, and the like, in that category. And that's, as you can imagine, an extremely broad category. We're talking about social media posts, digital files that are shared on private networks and the like. So the chief censor, interestingly, under the New Zealand system, has a mandate for classifying content that can be digital content, and has a call-in power of material that may present a harm to the public of anything in that category. So theoretically, the chief censor can call in anything on the internet that may that they think may present a harm to the public, which is a very, very broad power, and one that really needs to be applied carefully and judiciously, considering that the office is only about 25 people. So the impact that you can make on the impact, or the impact you can make on the internet is necessarily limited.
Listen, that's fascinating. I must share with listeners that the first email I got from David already many moons ago quite literally made me break out into a cold sweat, because listeners may be aware of the history of censorship in Sri Lanka, which is my home. And you can just imagine, from out of the blue, getting an email from the chief censor of New Zealand and what I thought that might contain and preface. So I can now laugh about it, but I know David knows this. It really did send shivers up my spine. So that, that gives you an idea, David, of what this office signals to those not from this country.
That's right. And I still remember your response to that initial email, Sanj, which I found very amusing, but I could absolutely understand that context and the impact on you having received a email out of the blue from the chief censor.
Listen, I mean, on that point, though, I guess you were appointed in 2017, and now the office nominally, in a sense, goes back to William Jolliffe in 1916. But your immediate predecessor held office, Andrew Jack held office from 2011 to 2017. So arbitrarily here, David, and, bear with me and play with me, if you will. From 2017, I suppose the greatest controversy at the time was when you called in 13 Reasons Why on Netflix, which seems almost quaint in 2022 as a challenge for the classification office to deal with. But my question is, from 2017 up until the pandemic, say the early months of 2020, in those 3 years, I kind of have a clue to the answer, but I want you to say it. What was the most consequential thing that occurred that really changed the way you look at things and the office looks at things? I'll talk about the period after the pandemic later on. I just wanted to go into that first period first.
Yes, certainly. I mean, without question, the most significant and impactful matter that we had to grapple with was the March 15 mosque attacks in Christchurch, the terror attacks. Now, most listeners will recall that those attacks were live streamed, and that horrendous live stream of that attack went viral across the internet, and was also associated with a document that was essentially promoting a white supremacist, vicious ideology. And so that was a situation where we needed to assess that, grapple with that, provide a legal classification of both the live stream and the so-called manifesto that was associated with the attacks. And that was highly, obviously it was nationally significant and critical in terms of responding to this horrific event. The other aspect, though, for me personally and for the office, was that this was a very, very unusual situation in terms of our role, because I mentioned how usually law enforcement will refer to us material for classification for law enforcement purposes. And that, by and large, is material that has had very, very small distribution, has almost no awareness amongst the wider public. But this was a situation where the live stream had been really virally propagated across the internet. It had started auto-playing on some people's social media feeds. I was aware that school children had been viewing the live stream lying on the floor in lockdown in their classrooms in Christchurch, wondering what the hell was going on. So this was something that the public awareness of was astronomical. Everyone was aware that this was out there, and in fact, people had been viewing it and sharing it in horror. And trying to understand what had occurred in the immediate aftermath. So part of the challenge there was that fortunately we had already been grappling with terrorist promotional videos, atrocities, manifestos and the like. So we had a framework to start with. But part of the challenge was really the public communication and engagement about effectively coming to a determination very quickly that this was unlawful under New Zealand law, but also communicating to the public about what that meant. And what that meant primarily was that we had to accept and understand that people had seen this, that people did have copies of it, that people had shared it in the aftermath, not really understanding what this was and what they were doing, but setting the expectations of what needed to happen now. If you did have a copy, get rid of it. Don't share it. If you see it, notify authorities about it. And to some extent, we didn't know how the public would respond to that because this was an unprecedented event. But I'd have to say, remarkably and somewhat reassuringly, people got it. People got that this was harmful, that this was unlawful, and that it should be treated as such. So really a remarkable confluence of issues and challenges all coming together in a very short period of time.
Would you, I wonder, agree that March 2019 was in a sense crossing a Rubicon for the office? I mean, I don't know whether you've talked with Mr. Andrew Jack, your predecessor, but it seems to me to be the case that what you dealt with that month, that day, and the day after, and the years after that, you yourself mentioned it's unprecedented. I wonder whether the office has dealt with anything remotely akin to, approximating, or even, adjacent to what you did and what the office had to confront.
I think there's little doubt that those events was crossing the Rubicon in quite a real and important way, for the reasons that I've been outlining, but also because for me, I think it was an inflection point that signposted the way to quite a horrific future, in terms of the potential weaponization of the internet, in terms of potential propagation and magnification of this sort of terror. And I would say we've in the office we never dealt with anything subsequently of that magnitude and that level of kind of proliferation and amplification, but we have subsequently dealt with many terror attacks and live streams or attempted live streams and other manifestos. In fact, horrendously, this has become something of a playbook for, in particular, white supremacist killers, but also other ideologies. It was an example of what could be done to exploit the vulnerabilities and the inbuilt mechanisms on the internet and social media. And we've seen multiple examples since, none with the same degree of impact and proliferation in the New Zealand context, but certainly in other countries, and certainly with the same potential for harm and inspiration for others that might be seeking to follow suit here and elsewhere. I would also say I think those events and what I did, what the office did in the response phase, really brought to a critical point the realization that we weren't equipped.
Yeah.
So I had already been saying publicly before March 2019 that the legislation we were operating under was 1993 legislation. Effectively, it was pre-internet. There's coverage of digital material, but the drafters of the law really had only the most embryonic concept of what the internet was and what it was going to become.
Yeah.
And really, I think everyone could appreciate, right, this is serious, and we've got aspects, harms, and dimensions to this that we need to think through and anticipate in terms of a framework to respond.
Now, that's a segue to the second part of that first question, which is you then had the pandemic. I mean, there was no respite for you. There was no rest for you. You went from one to the other in a sense, though you would think that it had nothing to do with the classification office being biological in nature. Up until the time, I suppose, the WHO had to coin a phrase to capture what was online the equivalent, if not worse, of the biological virus, which was the infodemic, as they called it, or some of us, like myself, call now information disorders or disinformation and misinformation and the cornucopia of harms that occur as a consequence. Can you, if March 2019 was crossing the Rubicon, what did you confront with, deal with, didn't anticipate, but was, but as an office and as the chief censor were forced to deal with and respond to meaningfully in that period up until you left your office?
Yeah, look, it was all connected in a way, certainly connected in my mind, because the work that I and the office did post-March 2019 was all about understanding the pathology of extremism and understanding the pathways and understanding how, in particular, digital media is potentially accelerating or enabling the pathways to extremism. And so part of our work in that area, we connected with a lot of international experts and organizations to triangulate and understand this better. And all of that was teaching us about effectively what is often termed the rabbit hole these days, in terms of the rising kind of levels of extremism that people will encounter, sometimes by virtue of an innocent Google search, or just, you know, clicking on a YouTube video and following the recommendations that are made from there. And so all of that had us thinking about conspiracy theories and misinformation and their linkages to extremism. So, you know, if you think about it, the manifestos that white supremacists put out are an example of conspiracy theories. You know, there's the white replacement theories and white supremacist theories that have their origins in conspiracy theories that go right back hundreds of years in terms of anti-Semitic thought and the like. And so we had been thinking about that a lot. And come early 2020, with when the pandemic started ramping up and becoming a matter for concern, I was immediately mobilized about what that might mean in terms of a pandemic situation where people would be in lockdown, people would be anxious, people would be spending more time online. And I was very much taken by some of the early work from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They got onto this early in 2020 and looked at misinformation propagators in the UK ecosystem, identifying the disinformation dozen, where 12 individuals were responsible for nearly 2/3 of the anti-vaccine misinformation in the UK ecosystem. And if you dug further into who those individuals were and their motivations, you uncovered some very serious and problematic intentions. So all of that came together for me as the pandemic started approaching New Zealand. There was a bit of a lag, you know, as we saw the wave of the virus cover the globe. And I started talking to people throughout the system about my concerns for what this would mean in terms of not just an infodemic, but a rise in very, very extreme conspiracy theories that would ultimately be connected to or have at their base a white supremacist or an extremist ideology motivation. I just, from the work that we were doing, that step seemed almost inevitable to me. And again, I was talking to people about my concern that the system was not ready and prepared for that sort of onslaught.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that twice, and I tend to agree with you. I would agree. I would submit that I don't think I know of, in my limited research and reading, any system that is fit for purpose, to be fair, by this country, my own and all of the jurisdictions that I've been studying for a while now, which I guess opens up a lot of questions. But in the main, David, sadly, also as a consequence of what many have confronted during the pandemic here after March 2019, more generally speaking, reading about these challenges globally. My question is, you know, what role or relevance does regulation have anymore? And we've talked about this. So just to give listeners a background, I mean, you know, contest me if you want. I don't see regulation as we've done it in decades past to be fit for purpose, where you have a consultative process, you pass the legislative framework, and then that is then seen as the gold standard that will last hopefully for a couple of years till you have to review and revise again. I think that the pace of challenges and the complexity of online media landscapes has completely made that a bit quaint. But nevertheless, we are still talking about regulation. The country is going through a regulatory reform process. I've looked at FVPCA from 1993, and you're right, but to be charitable, social media didn't exist at the time. Neither did the web as we know it today. I mean, so it was, it was a pre-web, time. Certainly IM, and smartphones didn't exist. So, I mean, you really can't talk about its application today and all of that. But my question again is, listeners would wonder what role and relevance regulation can meaningfully play. And with the long gaze and with the consequential period that you were chief censor, David, would you have an answer to that question, really?
Not a definitive answer, but maybe the start of an answer. I mean, my interest and concern about the pandemic and the infodemic or information disorder that would be associated with that was very much that I could see that this would create an increased number of volume of material that was in our wheelhouse, within the purview of the classification office and within scope for even the existing legislative framework. For example, early on in the pandemic, you might recall the plandemic conspiracy theory came up very, very quickly, and there was connections made to all of this being an engineered virus for the purpose of vaccinating the global population with nanobots that were going to be secretly put in the vaccine. And this was all connected with the 5G network, because the 5G network internationally would activate the nanobots and everyone would turn into state-controlled zombies or something to that effect. Now, shortly after that conspiracy theory being propagated across the internet, my office reviewed a Facebook video of individuals filming themselves pouring petrol on and setting a cell phone tower alight. It wasn't a 5G cell tower. They're quite small and innocuous towers. I think it was a large 5G or even earlier generation tower. But this was people filming themselves committing a crime, which at least technically falls within the framework for potential classification. And I could see, there was more of this sort of material that may come along. So I think that the purpose of kind of drawing that connection was, if ignored or forgotten about or disregarded, then the mechanics and dynamics of this results in more extreme content and more extreme behavior by extension. And that does absolutely get you into a law enforcement regulatory frame, right? The key is, though, well, what do you do about that? Because what I would say to people is, if you're just relying on the regulatory and criminal framework to respond, I'm sorry, you're waiting at the bottom of the cliff, because that we can see the engine room and the dynamics firing up, producing more and more of this material and potentially persuading or inspiring people to get into that frame. And if you're just in the response phase, I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. So you need to think about further up the pathways in terms of thinking about what are your tools and interventions to stop people or material from going over the cliff. And that, I think, to me, becomes both partially a regulatory challenge, partially an industry responsibility challenge, partially a community and public responsibility dynamic. And figuring out the roles and responsibilities and how that works in an integrated way is a critical imperative for us at the moment. But it's very, very interesting to see moves across the world in response to this. You've got a range of responses happening. You have some what in my view are very unhelpful responses in some countries, where it is all about trying to filter and prohibit material or criminalize material according to very loose definitions, which unfortunately in some countries just plays into the hands of the ruling party or
the government
in play at the time.
Yeah.
And so that becomes very much antithetical to what we would consider as the principles of freedom of speech and how free democracies should operate. But then you've got other more sophisticated approaches being generated out of the likes of the EU with the Digital Services Act, which effectively says, look, we have an industry operating here, a digital industry that we know and we have evidence can create harmful material and can be harmful to the public, just like any other industry. Rather than criminalizing the end user or the consumer of these products, how do we think about regulating the industry just as we regulate other industries that produce potentially harmful products to make sure that they're applying the right baseline standards of care and protection that might apply in this landscape? Now that's challenging, but far from impossible. And I think we are seeing some good thinking emerge in that area.
Which is a segue into maybe a reflection of what I'm assuming would not have been center and forward on your radar, which is an engagement with social media companies. In a sense, when you started in 2017 through to the late stages of your tenure in 2022, when I would imagine that if it wasn't a daily call or some sort of a communication, it would have been fairly frequent and potentially frustrating. But I don't want to preface it with an answer that I want you to agree with. But I genuinely do want to know, David, if we are, reflecting on your last answer as well, if we are looking at a constellation around the gravity that is constructed and generated by social media companies, respectively, around the users that orbit around various product platform surfaces. Reflecting on those years as chief censor, what strikes you as a leitmotif or a constant trope, something that was recurrent towards the later part of your tenure that wasn't present when you started, and what are your feelings about that?
Yeah, well, look, I think you've identified the progression pretty well. When I started in 2017, industry engagement for me was talking to film distributors, was talking to video importers, DVD importers.
Distributors, I would imagine.
Yeah. That's still around, and also, I thought I was being quite ambitious and brave, engaging with streaming providers like Netflix, to try and work out to build a relationship to start with, and try and figure out how we could apply an out-of-date regulatory system in a way that kind of made sense and would serve to protect the public better. So that was industry engagement for me in 2017. By 2022, yes, that was still there. But you're right. I was very much more, speaking more frequently with the likes of Meta and TikTok and Google and Twitter than other industry platforms. So I think that just reflects a whole bunch of things that we've been talking about, but also reflects the fact that I think any modern regulator looking to engage with what it means to respond to harmful content, you've got to be talking about the main pipelines and platforms for that content, and you've got to be building relationships, because look, I don't care what new legislative or regulatory system you put in place, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to have some practicalities to be worked through, and you're not going to achieve that without some sort of relationship and connection and understanding with these platforms.
So I want to press you on that. How has any progress been made? Have conversations become just more complicated, so you keep conversing without, social sciences call these wicked problems? I mean, there is no arguably one solution or panacea. So have you kept talking? Has the frustration increased? Do you have or retain optimism? Looking back, what do you think around those engagements?
Yeah, look, I'm optimistic, and I would say progress has been made, and I would point to initiatives like the Christchurch Call as substantive and real and useful platforms to unpack the very real challenges and technicalities and complexities in this space. And to build relationships. And there's some brute facts that are just undeniable in this space. One is that social media companies and digital companies are companies that are in it to make profit. They are there to make money, and their decisions will always be shaped by that imperative for what they are as profit maximizers for their shareholders. That is what they are. So yes, there will be advantage or there will be leverage driven off asymmetries of information, inherent complexities in the space, that companies will rely on and leverage. The other brute fact, though, is that these companies realize that their stock and trade is their brand and their reputation. So they don't want to be seen as the bad guys. They want to be seen as helpful and supportive. They want to be seen as doing the right thing. And so I found that, quite a practical basis sometimes to move and get some sensible movement and solutions in place. But you've got a tension here.
Yeah.
You've got a tension in that actually the some of the fundamentals of these problems really are very expensive for these companies to address. And some of the solutions, I believe, to some of these issues cut right to the very core of the profit model run by these companies. Because, let's face it, they're in the business of profiling users, effectively monetizing the data that they hold, and monopolizing attention through whatever means is lawful and available to them. So, there's just some fundamental tensions and paradoxes in the system that I think everyone just needs to be real about as we navigate towards a better and safer internet.
I'm from Sri Lanka, where I've been studying some of this as a person of color and from the global south for a while, as you know, David. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on, and this is not a question, this is just a reflection. It occurs to me that given our country's shared histories, that what the social media companies have done, at least to my mind, is not too different from the ravages of colonialism, where our markets, we were the product, right? I mean, and I just reflect, you said it was expensive to fix, but whose fault is that? It's not you or I. We didn't create this problem. And what the global north and the west on both sides of the Atlantic and even Aotearoa, New Zealand are now dealing with, we've confronted, dealt with, had to negotiate, and have died as a consequence of for well over a decade. So, it does, I am angry, but as, at the end of the day, it's also a conversation that we need to have. But I do wonder where the responsibility and the accountability, if not reparations and remediation, will, and if they ever will occur. That framing, I think, is an important one, at least from where I come from, from the global south.
I think it will occur. I think it will occur, Sanj, because people die. Again, that's a brute fact about what it is that we're talking about, and it's becoming the evidence and the understanding about these mechanics and how they apply is growing. Where people we were kind of in the dark, you could argue, and very much running without information and data and understanding, and that is growing. And that's a key component also of what we've got to leverage and utilize. The other aspect of how these companies, these global digital companies operate, is they're running trials all the time. They're running experiments all the time. It's very, very, their research and analytics capability is absolutely monumental, because it serves their profit architecture.
Surveillance capitalism.
That's capitalism at its finest, and they're just doing what the system allows them to do. And one of the things that it very much allows them to do is run trials in countries like Sri Lanka or other countries to just see how this change in the algorithm operates. And I think they're making mistakes, and I think some of the implications of some of those mistakes may be that people die, or that there's significant social unrest, or there's impacts on democracy. We're seeing all of these warning signs right across the world. Again, poorly understood, but we're getting better at analysing and understanding and unpicking what's going on here. So going back to your question about, well, is there a regulatory frame or a solution here? And I've said, well, yes, partially, but it's got to be seen in the context of a broader framework of response and approach. I think part of the state responsibilities for all states is to understand and look and start to foot it with the digital companies in terms of the choices and experiments and trials that they might be running, and not just leave it to the companies to figure out what went wrong and sweep it under the carpet, but for there to be a state awareness of this dynamic as well. And that also plays back into some of the moves and thinking coming out of the EU and other places to really say, yes, there is an industry responsibility here, but the industry isn't going to take responsibility unless there's some kind of watchdog or someone looking over their shoulder, making sure that they're taking responsibility.
So, in terms of a penultimate, I suppose, question linked to Aotearoa New Zealand is this, what I find quite a unique country community context where, after the Christchurch Commission's report in particular and its stress on social cohesion, David, it kind of speaks to what you articulated as, and correctly, I think, to my mind, non-technical, high-touch, community-oriented, community-led approaches and responses to what we've been all talking about. And I'm mindful about the fact that, for example, the elephant in the room is Telegram, right, in Aotearoa New Zealand. It's with CCTLDs, the country-level, top-level domains that currently harbor, and I won't mention it for obvious reasons, but significant harms against the Prime Minister and other government officials and ordinary Kiwis, and they're platformed, right? So, if March 2019 was one specific set of issues that you had to deal with in terms of vectors of irrigation and pathways of harm, I suppose it's a cornucopia of hate, hurt, and harm that you find today. And I wanted to ask you a non-technical question in response to the Commission's report as well, around what you think are, fit for purpose, high-touch, Aotearoa specific approaches to all of this that you've dealt with, that in a sense, I suppose, complement, don't replace, but are vital to and quite unique in the world around meaningful responses to digital harms.
Yeah, look, I think that dimension is key, because it comes down to Well, if you're going to regulate, or if you're going to have some kind of state role and responsibility here, then why? What for? Who's it for? And I would argue that who it's for is for the people who are going to get harmed. And who's going to get harmed the most? Who are the most vulnerable communities? Who's facing the most hatred? And I don't think you can operate the system unless you've got that community engagement and dialogue to inform why you're regulating and who for, because otherwise you'll just create a regulatory system that works for government officials and for the industry. I'm sorry, it might be tidy, it might be convenient, but it probably won't have the results and outcomes that you're looking for to make the actual difference out there in the world and to make people's lives better and safer. The only way you're going to have the insights and engagement to do that is to have genuinely deep and informed engagement with those communities. And I think here in Aotearoa, we've got some unique, I agree, I think we've got some, we're a unique society in many ways, and we've got some unique advantages in driving exactly that kind of dynamic. We're still not great at it, but I think we've got some of the foundations in place to make that work well. And if we can do that, then I think that could be a really important model and insight for other places in the world.
So, I mean, I promise this is the penultimate question. I oftentimes one glosses over, for me at least, what is a really interesting part of umbilically connected to the classification office, which is the youth advisory panel. Now, I actually don't honestly know, David, when this came about. Why? I do think it's quite interesting and important because 2021's report on the work of the advisory panel mentions a national security discussion and dialogue with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And I really found it quite interesting. And I quote, the representatives of the youth advisory panel said, "We are anxious about online radicalization. The lack of internet regulation allows communities of like-minded people to connect, share, hate, and incite violence. Some of us expect an event like the Christchurch mosque attack to happen again in the future," end quote. So, I mean, that's quite worrying, but also extremely insightful. I know from personal experience in our March 21 conference that the panel members were extremely intelligent, really tuned into some of the stuff that adults actually, find hard to grapple with. So I just want to place that on record. I don't think that's well appreciated within Aotearoa, but certainly across the rest of the listeners where they are as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Look, it's interesting what they have to say, and it's very powerful. So the genesis of the Youth Advisory Panel was a discussion that started up very soon after I came on board in 2017, where effectively I was saying, look, we're doing so much of this age restriction and classification and warnings for teens, young people, teens. Has anyone asked them what they think? Do you think it might be useful if we engaged with them to really understand what will help them and what they consider the most problematic? And from that fairly simple, in hindsight, pretty obvious question, we set up the Youth Advisory Panel, which is 12, a shifting membership of 12 teenagers who we put a lot of work into ensuring that they felt safe, that they knew that they could talk very frankly to us, and that they would be listened to. And I'm really proud of the work that we did in setting up that panel, because they provided us with incredible insights. into our assumptions and to what the world was like for them, which is actually at times quite a shocking and scary world. Actually, if you allow teenagers the time and space and security to speak frankly about the world they inhabit. So we got a tremendous amount of insight from them, and I'm really proud that they have engaged with other important policy discussions across a number of fora, just as the one that you quoted from as an example of. And again, you can't do too much of this. It's just another aspect of just what we were talking about in terms of engaging with communities that are affected. Ask them, talk to them. They will tell you, and your preconceptions will pretty soon be surfaced, and you'll know what's what, and that's incredibly powerful.
And in this domain, I think the adults are very often going to learn a couple of products and platforms they never knew existed. Leave aside how the information ecologies work for this demographic. I think we get it as fathers from our kids, but I mean, it's quite extraordinary that it was set up and established, and I do hope that it continues. David, the last question or set of questions, in a sense, I mean, two intertwined and connected ones, which is, I suppose, a hard one, but I ask it with the luxury of now you having left behind the role. What do you think was the greatest opportunity that presented itself during your tenure? That if you had a lifetime to be chief censor, you would have pursued more and harvested, and correspondingly, and feel free to ignore this if you want to. What was the one missed opportunity that you wish you knew more about or could have grasped the nettle of better in order to have done something more meaningful? So interconnected, feel free to focus on one or the other, or both.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, the big opportunity of which probably won't surprise anyone listening, hearing what we've been talking about, was the opportunity to drive change. Running on 1993 regulatory frameworks was almost risible, given how much things had changed, the complexity and the dimensions of what we're grappling with. So the opportunity there was to drive change, and I'd say it interconnects with your question, because I think we seized an opportunity in terms of driving an update to our regulation and our legislation in relation to streaming services. So when I started, the likes of content streamed by Netflix or Amazon and Neon and the like had no regulatory requirements whatsoever. And partially fueled by the voices and perspectives of our youth advisory panel, our experiences with, the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why that you mentioned, and other content, we were able to get traction on the proposal for change, which was an innovative change allowing streaming platforms to essentially self-classify according to a framework that the classification office set. So we created a software tool that systematized our classification approach, and allowed them, the volumes of streaming content means that it doesn't make sense for, a group of classifiers to try and review and classify everything ourselves. But we could set up a framework where the outcome was functionally equivalent in terms of putting up warnings and age breakpoints and the like that New Zealanders could rely on, and was felt the same as what they would see if they were going to go see a film or other content. So that was a meaningful step, and the loss, I guess, was that we weren't able to get a hold of that potential framework and that the insights drawn from making that progress drive that further. Because if you think about that, providing warnings and consumer information effectively that's consistent and fit for purpose, with the platforms themselves doing it, that's a model that could be extended across, potentially a significantly broader span of content and material. And that in turn leads us to that broader regulatory, well, what's the fix here? How are we thinking about, where we get to next? So, I think looking back, yes, that was progress. Progress is hard for and hard won, but the insights that you get from engaging with that struggle are incredibly valuable and can be used to drive on to the next step, which is really not a silver bullet. Let's fix everything with one new piece of regulation or one new policy move. No, it's a process. It's continually going to be a process from here on out of engaging with the new and fresh challenges and thinking up new and effective means of responding to those.
Hey, David, thanks so much for sharing those thoughts. I am and have always been a passing guest in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I know that I have immensely benefited from our conversations, our exchanges, and your deep thought and reflection. I know you agonize over some of these issues and challenges, and I think that the point I wanted to make is that this country is significantly lucky to have had an individual of your caliber and your caring in that position for what was a consequential tenure. So thank you for not just joining me, but for what you have done and continue to inspire.
Many thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to talk again. Always a pleasure.